Given the fact that you've been focused on network states a lot recently, and your current new adopted homeland of choice has been Singapore, what have you looked at from Singapore? What have you learned in terms of effective ways to build a state? The last few decades for that country has been pretty
Amazing.
phenomenal. Yeah, like
Yeah.
pretty unprecedented. So what did you learn, or what are the lessons that should have been taken away from Singapore's ascendancy?
Well, so I am splitting time between Singapore and India. Um, and actually, I'm trying to spend a lot more time in India in particular, just because there's amazing, like that's also like the last 5 or 10 years in India have been phenomenal. And I mean, like on the ground, you've got the Starbucks, you've got the internet, and so on and so forth. But um, on your question on Singapore, I mean, they had Singapore is, I think, an important model for this century, because they had a CEO founder, right? Which was Lee Kuan Yew, who, was perhaps the single greatest leader of the 20th century. A lot of the other guys, who are quote great leaders, um, are wartime leaders. They killed a lot of people, or they ordered troops into battle. And look, there's an aspect of humanity, which is we respect conquerors, we respect winners, we respect that kind of thing, right? But Lee Kuan Yew did not, kill lots of people. He wasn't a communist dictator. He wasn't a wartime leader, and so on and so forth. He just leveled up a country, right? And in some ways, like one way I think about it is there's sort of like 4 levels of leadership. If you ask yourself, why does socialism keep arising over and over again? One way of answering that question is it is the easiest way to become a leader of men. Why? Because in any functional society, you can just start yelling that 51% is oppressed by 49%. And that will always work. Like you can find some axis and just start sandpapering that, okay? And, conflict is attention and attention is currency. And if you're shameless, you just level up. And basically, socialism is like the lowest skill way to put yourself at the head of a mob. It'll just always work in almost every country. And variants of this, let's call it demagoguery, right? Where you're pitting some fraction versus the other. Then you go one step up and you have nationalism. And nationalism is, okay, unify all of us against these other guys on their side of the border, like the English versus the French or whatever, wogs begin at Calais or something, I think was the ancient, saying or whatever, right? No offense to the French. I'm just quoting like the, old, English guys. So nationalism, the good part about nationalism is it stops the conflict internally. People are aligned internally. They've got a common cause. That's the good part. The bad part is it often starts wars, because people are so proud that it goes from, nationalism or patriotism into jingoism or chauvinism or imperialism or whatever, right? And they get into all these wars with people, and then eventually they get pushed back or whatever, right? Okay, so then you go one level up from that, and now you get to capitalism, and now you're unifying people on the basis of a common market cause. And now defeating the other guy doesn't mean killing them or starting a war. You're defeating them in the market in a voluntary way where they can submit and be acquired or what have you. You're virtualizing the conflict. And it's also positive sum. You're creating something of value, but you can lead a very large group. Like Jeff Bezos leads like 1 million people. The scale of capitalistic enterprises can be very, very large, right? And I don't think actually we've seen the limits of them yet. And then like the highest level I'd say is to be a technologist leader where you're like Elon and you're amassing all these people, and it's not just positive sum. You're not just building something non-violently. It's not just something in the market, but you're literally moving humanity forward by, you're not just building an organization that ships chairs, for example, which are valuable in the market, but that's building spacecraft that doing something that's never been done before. So the level of difficulty as a leader there is the highest, right? You should go from demagogue to nationalist to capitalist to technologist, and like the degree of difficulty of being a leader of men, of taking these folks, this capital, these resources, pulling them together and doing something, gets harder but more valuable to society in the medium to long run, because you're actually shipping something that pushes all of humanity forward. And then of course every other group can benefit from the technologists doing that. Then they take for granted 30 years later, that planes work, the trains work, that, they take all that stuff for granted, that small group pushed that forward and scaled it. But it was a small group that did that, right? And so from that sort of ranking of leaders, right, then like LKY is like capitalist technologies is basically like kind of there, right, somewhere in between, but very, very high, perhaps one of the best of the 20th century, perhaps the best of the 20th century, because what he did for Singapore, he pushed them forward. He did innovate actually on several things, like, with sovereign funds, with how he micro-optimized things like the approach from the airport. Do you know that?
No.
He really cared about the fact that visiting dignitaries, when they hit Singapore, that they would drive through and they'd see everything was clean and spotless. They'd be like, wow, okay, this is the spot in Asia for us to build our HQ. He understood, we would call it the importance of user interface. Okay, you have a clean user interface and it signals something about the site, right? Why is it that you want like a clean UX? It's like, okay, they polished it, right? And so that means like lots of things are correct about it. So he understood that basically the guys who were coming in to put capital into the country expected it to be a quote third world basket case, and they would be surprised to the upside. And so he would like drive back and forth on that route and be like, put a tree there, that needs to go away, this should not be done at this time, and so on and so forth, right? And that's just like one thing, but he set up Singapore Airlines, he did all kinds of stuff. He was basically the CEO of the country, and the thing about that is what I talk about in the network state is something where it takes aspects of it, at least 4 different countries, more than that, but it takes aspects of America, India, Israel, and Singapore, right? So part it takes from Singapore is the concept of a CEO founder of a country, right? Where it takes from America is, almost too many to enumerate, but the concept of like a constitution and of like an immigrant-like people, like a nation of immigrants, but a nation of emigrants, emigrants. What it takes from Israel is the concept of a country founded by a book. Theodor Herzl wrote a book called The Jewish State in the late 1800s, right around the turn of the century, proposing that the Jewish people they were a nation without a state, a stateless nation, proposing that they have their own country. And people thought he was totally crazy, and they built towards it. And 50 years later, Israel actually, happened. Now, that gets us to the fourth thing, which is India has nonviolent independence, right? And so, let's say with Gandhi, you had the nonviolent independence, right? So you take those 4 things, right? You have, America's constitution and all their contributions. You have Singapore's concept of the city-state run by a founder CEO. You have the concept of a nation started with a book, with a strong moral cause, right? And you have the concept of a nation started non-violently that managed to bind together folks of lots of different ethnicities, like both India and the US have done, right? And actually all 4 of those are really multi-ethnic states, right? Israel has Jews from around the world. Singapore has 4 different ethnicities. India and America have millions and millions of people from all around. India is like Europe, by the way. It's like North and South India are like Finland and Spain or something. They're as different as that, but they're all in one giant union, right? So those also, they have something else. What's in common among those 4 countries? They're all forks of the UK code base, right? Because like the American fork is like, what if we took all Europeans and, most Americans are no longer of Anglo descent, but the UK code base, became the constitution and so on. And Israel used to be a British colony, and Singapore used to be a British colony, and India used to be a British colony. So all
are you
of those,
saying that the Brits, that we got it right? Is that the lesson to take away from this?
I definitely respect the British people. I mean, like the thing is, one way I actually talk about the network state is when we can talk about it, but people will. So if you think about America, India, Israel, and Singapore, they're not anti-British or pro-British, they're post-British, right? So that's